in the some of the Hermetic astrological texts, which may have been influenced by some Egyptian ideas later in the Greco-Roman period in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries. The Decans become associated with spirits or daimons, and those are said to be like intermediaries between the human world, the sublunary sphere world, where humans live, versus the planets and the other gods and the fixed stars.
Exactly. Yeah. Occasionally, sometimes these figures are, loosely translated as the Decan figures are sometimes loosely translated as demons or daimons, because they play that kind of messenger role that is behind the idea of the daimon in Greek tradition. So yeah, I think there's some interesting connections and translation between earlier Egyptian ideas of the functions of these gods and what we see in later texts.
Yeah, and there's also something really important here that's embedded in this text that von Baumhard brings out, and she doesn't emphasize in terms of the later tradition, but that immediately struck me coming from the perspective of later Hellenistic astrology, several centuries later, which is she has these sections talking about the decans, and when they do work, when they come to like the ascendant or the midheaven, essentially, or what we would associate the eastern horizon, or when they culminate overhead and they're said to be doing work, because that's when you can use them in order to tell what time it is, as if they become more active when they hit those astronomical sectors of the sky. And that's very, to me, reminiscent of the later Hellenistic concept in Greek called krematistikos, which is the different sectors of the chart, or the different houses, which are primarily the 1st house and 10th house, where planets are said to become busy, or said to become more active in some way in terms of their ability to either produce astrological effects, or in terms of being able to just be prominent in terms of indicating certain things about a person's life and their birth chart.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the other interesting revelations about this text, is that that in each of these representations of a decade, there are also these different figures, one of which seems to represent according to von Baumhard's interpretation, one seems to represent the heliacal appearance of the decad, and then the others represent these different cardinal points. There's some debate between different interpreters on this, because there's just pictures and very terse little captions next to them. So it's a little hard to interpret. And different scholars have come to different conclusions about which is the most effective part and what's doing what. But all the scholars seem to agree that there's some relationship between these cardinal points and the effects of the decans, that they have particular effects at different, or are more effective at these times. So that debate will continue, I'm sure. But there's a concept there, a concept of angles or points being more effective. And you mentioned the 1st and the 10th house. Of course, that would be the rising and the culminating house, right? So and it seems to be that the rising, descending, culminating at midheaven, and the 4th house, I guess what we would call the house below, the point of invisibility, in terms of the way the decans are talked about. Those are the ones that are represented in this little sort of breakout chart of the decans and their positions.
Right. That's part of her interpretation, because she tries to connect it with a later text that we know from Hephaestio. That's this like mysterious text that was said to be associated with the decans, and that does mention like the rising and culminating and setting and anti-culminating decans in particular as being particularly important for some reason. And there's some possibility that could have been tied in with this earlier tradition associated with the nous of the decades.
That's right. Yeah, no, there's dispute about this. There's always debate as people try to arrive at different interpretations of these, very terse and difficult to read texts. So some people have different theories about it, but it does seem that in some way, I don't know if it's the right word, but angularity sort of plays a role, if you will.
Right.
That is,
Yeah.
the being close to one of these points seems to have an effect on the power or the effect of the decan.
Yeah, and there was one other point, and I might have to get my copy of the book to look this up really quickly, but it was something in von Baumhard emphasizes about there being like a poking or a stinging notion associated with those places where the decans are doing work. Do you remember that point or remember what that was about?
I'm afraid I don't remember it.
All right, let me grab my book really quickly because it's kind of an important point. I'll be right back. So one of the things that's relevant is just she also brings in another book that she says is important and tied into all of this, which is called the Book of the Fundamentals of the Course of the Stars. She said is formally called the Book of Newt. And are you familiar with that work?
Yeah. This is a text that has a long tradition. There was a publication several years ago now by Alexandra von Leven of this book on a papyrus version, but it seems to be commenting on inscriptions that are on monumental sites, temples, for instance. And those they are representations of the sky goddess Nut, and the passage of the stars through Nut and in the sky. And so this is where there's a mythology of the stars passing through the body of Nut, and then coming out and being visible again. That explains their visibility and disappearance. And this includes the movement of the decans as well. So this is what's fascinating is that again, this Demotic text, I believe, dates to the Roman period, but it's commenting on relief sculptures and inscriptions depicting the sky goddess Nut that go back, almost 1,000 years earlier.
So that's a really important point, this sky goddess Newt, because we should be like mentioning some of those mythological things as we go, because I know those are going to come up very prominently when we start looking at some of the, for example, like the ceiling zodiacs from different temples. But what was the goddess that was associated with the sky?
Yeah, that's Nut, N-U-T. This is a goddess of the sky, and so there's the higher upper sky, and then Shu, who's kind of like the atmosphere and the winds and so forth, and then Geb is the earth. And so in these depictions, they vary sometimes, but Shu is sometimes shown holding up Nut as the kind of dome of the sky, and then Geb is the earth. And so it's a kind of a representation of cosmology, or a description of the world. But the stars are sometimes in these texts imagined as disappearing when they enter the body of Nut and then reappearing when they emerge from the body of Nut. And that is, one of the ways they explain visibility and invisibility of stars.
Okay, so when we see some of the representations later on, when we get to some of the coffin lids that contain zodiacs and we see like a female figure in the middle of the zodiac signs, that goddess is what we're seeing.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. So all right, I pull out the book, and one of the things it's in the appendix, but one of the things von Baumhardt's pointing it out is she says that she says the culmination of the decans in the middle of the sky lasts approximately another 4 months. For the Egyptians, the main interest of the decanal stars was that they permitted the determination of the hours of night in order to regulate rites. Only during the time of the culmination does a decan assume this function of marking the hours. And that notion of marking the hours is like really important because that comes up later in the Hellenistic tradition. For the term for the ascendant was horoscopos in Greek, which literally translated means hour marker. And so there's some sort of connection there between what became the primary Greek or Hellenistic term for the ascendant and this like earlier Egyptian tradition of using the decans to mark the hours or to designate what hour is, essentially. And that also became tied in with, I think, the Egyptian like name for some of the priests that did that, I think became at some point that same term.